believe I'm the chair. I'm the chair of this panel. I'm also the discussant. So we'll get started in about 5 minutes. And well, we're scheduled to get started in 5 minutes, but we may allow a little bit of time for others to join us. Again, we want to thank everyone for joining us. The panel scheduled to start at 4:15. My name is Sekou Franklin. I'm the moderator and chair for this panel. We may get started a couple of minutes late. I usually check, I'm going to check my email to make sure that if there's any technical difficulties, we want to make sure we give people a chance to get in. I just sent an email to everyone just to make sure that we counted for anyone that had technical difficulties. Okay, so how you doing? Let's do a mic check. Karen Anderson, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay,
Can you hear
great.
me?
Yes, I can. And Cienna,
Okay.
can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. We'll get started. I was waiting on one more panelist, and I sent him an email, so I'll be double checking my email back and forth. And if he comes, we'll try to fit him in, and if not, then we'll go from there. Okay. So we'll get started because typically the way that this virtual conference works, we want to make sure we're on time. And for the panelists, if the other panelists are not here, that means you'll have more time to present. If that makes any sense. So we'll give you possibly a 12 or 15-minute window or so to give your presentation, depending upon when the other panelists come. And then we want to make sure we have a good, lively Q&A discussion as well. My name is Sekou Franklin. I'm the chair and also discussant of this panel. And I want to thank you for being here. This panel is being recorded, and it will be available in an unclean version. just note that through the conference platform, and should be up on the platform for a couple of months. The title of this panel is called "Through the Looking Glass: Politics, Imagery, and Sports," and we should have some excellent presentations. Our panelists are Karen Anderson of the School of Art Institute of Chicago. Forgive me if not sure if you're a professor or if you are a student. Forgive me if I did not say Professor or Dr. Anderson, whose presentation is called "More Than Color: The Marginalization of African Americans." Our next panelists, and we'll go in this order, we'll first have Karen Anderson, and our next panelist will be cici.benn of Howard University, all right, whose presentation is titled "Bearing Witness to Who We Are, Ditsie, and the Visual Art of Activism." And then we also have two other panelists who may be joining us. Is unclear. I'll say their names in case they do join us. Tariq Edwards of Claflin University, who is major researches on the Colin Kaepernick and sports protests. And then our other, I think it may be a co-authored paper. I could be wrong. It's unclear. But our other panelist, that paper is called "Black Nationalism in Sport: Redefining Black Male Perceptions." I think it's a co-authored presentation, although it's unclear based upon how it's presented in the conference program. So without further ado, we'll give each panelist 12 to 15 minutes. If Mr. Edwards joins us, then we'll cut it off at 12 minutes. If he doesn't join us, we'll give the panelists extended time. I'll offer friendly comments regarding each paper, and then we will go from there. Okay. I got to note that Tariq Edwards is presenting in another panel. It is an error that he is listed here, although I did get his paper. So, okay. So we'll give each panelist 12 to 15 minutes, and then we'll offer comments. Thank you. Karen Anderson, you're first.
I am almost logged into my computer so I can actually use my slides. My computer crashed, y'all, right as this was happening.
If you want to send me a quick email of your slides, I could show them.
Oh no, I'm logging in right now. Yeah, I'm coming actually into the Zoom. So that I'm gonna log out of this one and come into that one, okay?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
While she's logging in, Ms. Ben, are you okay with going first then?
Sure. Would that be a conflict if she comes back? I don't want to overstep.
Okay, we'll wait for her. Just give us a second. She had some Wi-Fi problems earlier, so she may. Yeah. Folks, if you could just hold on and be patient for another couple minutes. She's back. Okay. Allegedly. Okay. Okay.
All right. I totally apologize for being late, y'all, but my computer crashed.
Oh,
but
no problem.
I am
ready. Virtual platform. Okay, you're first.
Right. It's like I've been getting geared up all day, being ready, but I am so glad to talk about this topic here. I spent some time researching it and trying to figure out what I could do, because one of the things is that I love the history of it, the history and pulling the pieces together, but I also love what's happening. I remember I was watching a panel earlier today and somebody said this was the decade of African-American women. And I was like, you so right, because that is what my research was showing me. But it isn't one of those things that just happened. It was something that folks worked at a long time to get to. And that's kind of like where some of my stuff is coming from. And my PowerPoint will be up in a moment. But I talk about how we are more than a color, even though we're just seen as a color, because it's always about, oh, the color of your skin, or because the color of our skin somehow seems to equate with what it is we can do. And so that was the interesting thing that I found in my research. And I call it more than a color because that's what it became to me. As I was, one of the things I ran across in my program was there was one year on the cover of mainstream magazines, there were a lot of African-American women. And it happened like in 1 month or 6 weeks period. There were like all of these women who were on covers of magazines and they all looked like us. It was like, what happened here? Because they used to tell us, oh no, we can't put y'all on magazines because, y'all won't sell our magazines. And it happened. And the thing that got me about this whole thing was there were 2 women who had control over what happened. And that doesn't happen every day, especially when they look like us. And so it was interesting for me to go with that. And that's where I went. And so I started asking questions about this. And as I began to ask these questions, I started to see some things. And my slides are coming. And it's called The Marginalization of African American Beauty. Like I say, 2018 was a significant year. Brown became beautiful for something. And so in my paper, I described three images I call works of art. And what I did is I set out to talk to people who actually worked on those. Because my question was, because with African Americans, I know with me, beauty and pain were equal. I still remember as a small child having to go to get my hair pressed. You know, me and my sister walking to, to go to the beauty shop where someone took a hot comb and straightened our hair. And that was considered good hair. And that's what beautiful people look like. If you had kinky, that was not considered beautiful. And it usually brought you a whole lot of trouble. And so as I started looking at art, because I attended School of the Art Institute and I'm a graduate student there. One of the things I noticed quite easily was early artwork from Africa is considered artifacts versus early artwork from the Europeans are considered classics. And if you go to a museum, most of the time they're in two separate locations. So what makes something beautiful? Who gets to decide? And is it the people who work on it? Because we know that's it. The people who work on it decide what it is. And so I started back. I mean, like I said, I did the research and the history, and I looked at people tried to control what the Africans looked like as soon as they had the opportunity. In the French colonies, one of the things that they did is they brought people from Africa who could tend to the crops. And these people were intelligent, they could read and write. And one of the things they do is they learned the French system. They learned their laws. They bought their freedom. And so then you had all of these women who were business owners making money. And so they started buying beautiful clothes and doing their hair. And pretty soon the Caucasian women were like, wait a minute, what is this? We can't have them looking better than us. They made laws to say you cannot look good. You got to tie up your hair. You have to wear slave clothes. You cannot look better than us. It became a matter of law. And as a matter of fact, the British colonies learned even better. They said, as a matter of fact, for their slaves, they had to wear a cheap type of clothes. If they caught you in like the master's hand-me-downs, they could strip you naked and take those clothes. Slaves had to wear slave clothes. As a matter of fact, they made them a certain color so that they would know whether you were in slave clothes or not. So they decided how people were going to look. And they did this early and often. So one of the questions I asked is something that you wear, could that be considered artwork? And is it only artwork if it's made for somebody special? One of the people I talked to was a designer who created floral arrangements. And John Philip Perry is an artist and he lives in the UK. And he had this idea around what it is he wanted to do in this thing. And he was just, some guy looked into this and he was like, oh my God, I get to do this. And so he is creating artwork for a photo shoot for Vogue. And he was a great interview because he just had all these ideas. And it was really funny. You can tell he was a person who was not a part of the machine because he was willing to talk to me. Most of the other people in this who were part of this photo shoot didn't want to have nothing to say because of whose photo shoot it was. And you know what? They wanted to work with that person again. But this guy, he was like, it was an amazing experience. It changed his life. And as a matter of fact, the artwork actually went into a museum. And he was like, that was beyond anything I ever imagined would happen. And I'll tell you a little bit later what the photos are. And our crown, as I look at our hair, because when African Americans first came out of slavery, I mean, most of them were dealing with all kinds of diseases in the head, hair wouldn't stay, things were falling out, bald patches, but because they didn't have the nutrition, they didn't have the hygiene, because most of them lived in places where they weren't washing their hair or taking care of these things. And so women like Sarah Breedlove said, you know what? I think we can do something about this. She went to work for a woman who was selling hair care products. And of course, you know, because we're all different and we all have different texture type of hair and different stuff is going to work on different folks, she experimented with it. And I mean, I just have to stop and think about that. This is a woman who's come up with very little education who said, you know what, if I put this chemical and this chemical together, it's probably going to work better on my hair. And that's what she would do. She would sit and she would put stuff together, and she came up with stuff to come that would help Black women with their hair. The other thing she did is she created a market of people who work only with other Black people. And so she creates this system where she trains women how to go out and do hair and sell the products. And she's sort of like the first Avon lady. But they, of course, will let you believe they were the first person who created this. But she and the other women during this time created this system where they would go door to door selling this stuff, this product, to other African-American women. And one of the things that she discovered was, you know what? If you feel good about your hair, you get more confidence to do other things. But there was a way that people wanted us to see ourselves. So the images you would see of African Americans during this time period were not women like her. I mean, I was surprised. I was a grown person before I actually saw images of Sarah Breedlove to say, wow, that's what African American women could look like back then. That's not what I saw. I saw people who looked like the character that Hattie McDaniel played. They were people who looked like mammies. And I mean, there's nothing wrong, because you know what? There were a bunch of women in my neighborhood who looked like that. And those were some of the best women of my life. Those women shaped who I became. But another of the big entrepreneurs that came out of this is a lady named Nancy Green. Nancy Green had been born a slave in 1834. But some white gentlemen said, you know what? We want you to sell pancake mix for us. And she was like, okay, I will sell this pancake mix for you. And it wasn't until last year, y'all, they took her image off that pancake mix. When Nancy said, I would do this for you, they said, huh! Everybody associated this pancake mix coming from this Black woman and not from the two white guys who really invented it. And so she created somewhat of an image of what African-American women look like. That was our beauty. And so the other women who looked different from her couldn't be successful. I think it was absolutely amazing that the woman like Hattie McDaniel won an Academy Award for playing the role that everybody thought African-Americans looked like. The first African-American to win an Academy Award, playing the role of Mammy from Gone with the Wind. And as a matter of fact, they didn't even want to let her in to accept the award. Made us sit by the kitchen because they did not value what it was we were bringing to the table. Whoops, sorry, I went too fast. Vernon is a celebrity hairstylist. Vernon works with hair. And one of the things that Vernon totally understood was that people found confidence in themselves through how they dealt with their hair. Vernon's work has been featured on Vogue, Vanity Fair, Harper's Bazaar. He has been doing this so long, he's developed his own line of products of how to take care of hair. But in the one that he was, in the interview I did with him and the person he worked with her before. Matter of fact, he works with her all the time. And he was like, my goal during this was to make her feel more confident in herself. Because he understood that's what hair did for him, for folks. And he did it. And as I say, he get called all the time. Again, this is another person in the UK, because the people who work here, they don't answer your calls because they want to continue to work with those folks. But somehow the folks in the UK are like, you know what, we'll talk to you. So when I talk about pushing the limits, I want to talk about the folks who said, you know what, I'm stepping outside this box. You have people like Josephine Baker and Dorothy Dandridge who did not look like mammies, and therefore they had a really hard time making it. And so one of the things that they really had to push on was the whole sexuality of their image. And Josephine Baker said, you know what, if this is what you want, I'm going to give it to you, but I'm going to give it to you the way I want to give it to you. You don't get to decide how this comes. And that was a beautiful thing that I loved. I mean, it even rolls back from Gambia. I'm going to give it to you, but I'm going to give it to you the way I want to give it to you. And so she really took control of that narrative. Dorothy did not have as much, she didn't have as much sway with that. She couldn't do that. As a matter of fact, she's the first African-American woman that they put on the cover of a mainstream magazine. But of course, they put her on there in character. She's not like Dorothy being herself. She is being the character from Carmen Jones in the movie that she starred in. And so Alexei was the photographer I chatted with. And Alexei was a very interesting person in the fact that he works with everybody. But one of the things that he did as a photographer was he said, look, I really want to work with more diverse group of people. He got tired of going to photo shoots and everybody there was blonde and blue eyes and this. And he said, look, can I have more people? And the magazines were like, well, you know, that really doesn't sell. So what Alexei did is he did his own book. He hired models who looked all different ways. He brought them in and he shot everybody, and he created a book that showed that beauty is far different than just one way. And I was really impressed with Alexei because I was like, you don't have to do this. All you have to do is show up and shoot. But instead, he was saying, no, I want to make sure that beauty is recognized as being more than one way.
You have about 2
Is
minutes.
beautiful.
Here. You have about 2 minutes.
Okay.
Here.
Okay. All right. I'm about to wrap it up. In the late 50s, a group of folks were celebrating a Marcus Garvey birthday, and they came across a guy who was holding a beauty pageant. New York City, in I think the Bronx. Was it the Bronx? And they got the idea to hold beauty pageants for women for African-American women who wore their hair natural. And they called the movement Black is Beautiful. And these are the guys who put this together. They created something called the African Jazz Art Society. And they did music and fashion shows, and the woman who won $100. So there was this thing, you know, in the 1950s and 60s, to win $100, I'm gonna have to wear my hair natural. There was no wigs. Everybody was wearing afros. I was like, this is cool. And so I talked to Bob, and Bob was telling me, he was a graphic designer and photographer for these folks. And he told me what the process was like. He was totally surprised that people would come in and do this, because, you know, there was a time, and you know how folks do, they'd be like, what are you doing with your hair? You know, you can't do that. You know, you need to get your hair pressed. And so women would fight back or push back from that and say, no, we want to wear our hair natural. And some of the work that they did, the AJS created the Grandiosa models. And these models started work in 1962, and they worked around Harlem. They were on album covers and all kinds of advertisement in the area and the local thing, but they had afros. And the first like model to be on a magazine is going to be LaDanya Luna. She did Harper's Bazaar in 1965 and Naomi Sims in 1968. But, you know, we would get them far and in between. And they like to erase the race. Like this 1965, that's LaDanya. They made her almost look Asian because they erased the race from her. But these are the artworks I describe in my paper. And the image of Beyonce is one that's in a magazine now. And this Serena is the one that was on the cover of Harper's Bazaar. And these are the magazines that the 12, or I think it was 8 to 12 of these, where all of these folks were on the main cover of magazines around the world, like within a 6-week period in 2018. The difference is with Serena and with Beyonce, which I thought was amazing, is they get to pick which images you get. Remember the story we heard about the vice president where she was mad because of what image they put on there? Beyonce only releases the ones she wants on there. She sits down with the photographer at the end of the shoot and she goes, this, and this. This is what you can send to the magazine. That is power. That is totally controlling your own narrative.
Okay. Thank you, Cienna. Great presentation. Next, we have cici.benn.
Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, can you all see my screen? And can you hear me okay? Okay. Hi everyone, my name is cici.benn. I'm a senior Afro-American Studies and Sociology double major at Howard. And my presentation today is entitled Bearing Witness to Who We Are, Bev Ditsie and the Visual Art of Activism. This is a project I did this past summer for UCI's Activist Studio West digital repository. And my motivation for this project stemmed largely from my past studies of the relationship between visual art and activism. Specifically, a Black aesthetics course that I took at Howard my sophomore year introduced me to the history of artists and their expressions of Black radicalism and the reconfigurations of Black identity throughout the course of social movements like the Black Arts Movement and the Harlem Renaissance, etc. This class provoked me to see how visual artists, especially ranging anywhere from photography to design, were directly influenced by their communities and crafted art that helped them to narrate the social movements that they existed in. And this art could look like the iconic memorialized Black and white photos of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and their protests and sit-ins at diners raising freedom signs during the Civil Rights Movement. Or it can also take the form of an acrylic mixed media portrait of Angela Davis centered in an Afro-Cobra painting to immortalize her Black power slogans in vibrant color. Or even today, the way that activism can be an active social media presence that catalogs and advocates for abolition using hashtags and creative infographics on Instagram. What this all taught me is that in all, what we consider to be activism has much to do with what we see and how we validate that implicit visual culture. So if we can understand its implicit relationship between activism and its subsequent imagery, then we may consider the ways that Black activists look and see as a part of an extensive legacy of visual artists within the Black radical tradition of cultural, intellectual, and action-oriented works crafted to dismantle Western social, political, economic, and cultural norms rooted in colonialism and anti-Blackness. So though visual arts by nature fundamentally bear witness to the movements of their time, the artists that are responsible for creating them are usually often involved in the movements themselves. So this nexus is where activist Bev Ditsie resides, as her vocal advocacy for the LGBTQ rights movement and visual arts converge. Dr. Beverly Palesia Ditsie is a filmmaker, director, musician, and writer from Soweto, South Africa. She's mostly recognized as one of the co-founders of the gay and lesbian organization of Witwatersrand, or GLOW, founded in 1988, which is responsible for organizing the first Pride March in Johannesburg, South Africa in 1990. Her organizational voice was responsible in part for the creation of the Equality Clause of the new South African Constitution under President Mandela in 1994. And the Equality Clause prohibited discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, and her advocacy basically afforded her the opportunity to become the first openly lesbian woman to address the United Nations at the 4th Conference on Women in Beijing in 1995. This is where she advocated for LGBTQ rights to be actively regarded as human rights for the first time in front of the UN. But in addition to her political strides, Ditsie has written, directed, and consulted over 20 documentary films and a variety of educational and reality television shows over the last 16 years. Her filmmaking and work as a director acts as an extension of her activism in the visual world, where she can challenge those silences and spaces where queer Black women haven't traditionally been allowed to exist within media. And furthermore, her films are really rich with intimate narratives and imagery of Black life that center women, gender nonconforming, and queer voices as a tool for social justice and healing. So some of the questions that I derived to begin my research include: what informs Bev Ditsie's activism and what informs her art? What's the relationship between organized activism and media activism? And how does Bev Ditsie's work act as an extension of the Black radical tradition accordingly? So in my thesis, I assert that Bev Ditsie continues the Black radical tradition of visual art activism by crafting an essential visibility and privileging the autonomy of narrative to eradicate the structures of historical erasure and reframe the Black identity around the principles of intersectionality and self-love. I really intend for my research to respond to the growing need for scholarship that includes media arts within the general sphere of activism and records Bev Ditsie's contributions to this area especially. So Bev Ditsie's filmmaking really rests in the context of the history of South African art activists before her. The Medu Art Ensemble was a collective of visual artists, writers, photographers, and performance artists that fled South Africa as exiles in the 1980s, determined to continue the fight against apartheid using tools of culture. So amid the South African psychological, political, economic, and militaristic counterinsurgencies to push back the rise of Black power during the movement of Black consciousness, Medu produced graphic photo collages and posters with powerful slogans that proclaimed, quote, "Political struggle is an unavoidable part of life in South Africa, and it must therefore infuse our art and culture. Art is a weapon of the struggle." The Medu Art Ensemble thoroughly radicalized the politics and culture of South Africa during the 1980s through visual art activism that was rooted in members of resistance in the movement itself, just as Bev Ditsie's art activism was rooted in her participation in GLOW. So through the 1990s, GLOW campaigned for gay and lesbian rights through the visibility of various media platforms from print to television. And a lot of scholarship on GLOW most notably discusses their hand in creating a lot of programs for their community, including the Township AIDS Program, or TAP, and the Gay Man's Health Forum, in addition to organizing the very first Pride Parade, as they're known for, in Johannesburg, South Africa in 1990. However, scholar Letabo Malula asserts that though these annual parades are still going on today, they lack the political ethic and space for the essential intersectional consciousness that they were founded with by GLOW originally. She asserts that the erasure of Black women from today's Pride scene, queer Black women from today's Pride scene, censors the reality of violence committed against them even to this day, as well as the legacy of their voices in protest in shaping the space itself. Their material struggles, impacted by the simultaneous implications of race, class, and gender, are really excluded from the LGBTQ celebrations and recognition, rendering the bodies of queer Black women and gender nonconforming people to, quote, "remain unimagined and invisibilized by narratives that serve to sensationalize their lived experience." So Ditsie really combats this erasure directly through film by producing imagery that draws forth these intersectional bodies from invisible imaginations to our realities, and speaking on their untold and erased histories in documentary form primarily. So though a lot of movement journalists and popular historians have offered biographical accounts of Ditsie's life, she still remains largely understudied by sustained academic research. So the promise of my research through this project is being able to be the first art historian that works on her materials toward a rigorous study. So for this project, I utilized, my research method incorporated an oral history interview, social media research, media interviews, and her first documentary, Simon and I, about her mentor, Simon Nkoli, as a piece of semi-autobiographical material in order to understand how she represents herself as a primary source. And I also parsed through digital archives and dissertations and journal articles to look at her participation in different LGBTQ organizations and programs before crafting some of the questions that I was going to use for my oral interview with her. So my research questions I sectioned into 6 main categories: early years, political awakening and activism, community building, self-care, art and film, and my concluding questions, based on a lot of the topics that I felt needed more exploration and my ultimate interest in what informs her art activism altogether. So I asked her questions about what her household felt like growing up and what her international experience with activism was like, and how her work today, how she felt her work today, really contributed to her legacy of activism and how it spoke to that in the visual world. And our interview was roughly about 3 hours long, and she delved really deeply into each question, and her stories and responses overlapped really beautifully with her social and political frameworks that I was looking to investigate. So here's a clip from my interview with Ditsie.
We are still not the ones telling our stories from a point of view and a place of love, from a place of greatness. And so I really believe that for us to heal as a people, and I'm very clear when I say a people, I am first centering Black. I am first centering women. I am first, there's no primary or secondary, they are all one. I am centering queer. I am centering us in here.
So when I asked Ditsie what the significance of producing Black and queer-made cinema was today, I found that the framework for intersectionality was central to her philosophy and her politics. As she stated in the clip, I'm first centering Black, I'm first centering woman, I'm first centering queer, and really pausing to emphasize the lack of hierarchy between them. She also discussed with me how self-care is essential to sustainable activism. Despite the traditional notions of activists, that activists must sacrifice their emotional and mental health for the sake of their movements. And lastly, she reiterated to me the value of film and media as tools for visibility and healing, beyond the forces of representation especially, signifying that the purpose of her work was to, quote, counter the erasure and bring back that self-love and pride of who we are outside of them, in order to heal the Black identity beyond the context of oppression and beyond the forms of representation that they've internalized from the implications of colonization and anti-Blackness that they live within. So in all, through my exploration of Dr. Bev Ditsie's work as a visual arts activist, of the Black radical tradition within the context of Black studies, art history, and the sociological framework of intersectionality, I arrived at a diverse set of conclusions. The first being that Black queerness must occupy the center of the radical imagination, as they do in Ditsie's activism, in order to eradicate systems of discrimination holistically. I also learned that visual arts are historically proven to be a necessary tool against colonialism and anti-Blackness through using this form of visibility that resists against the violence of erasure by challenging our popular and dominant cultural memories. And finally, that self-love is itself a form of radical activism, as it prioritizes mental health and counters the internalized anti-Blackness to sustain the movement from within us. So we don't have to fall apart for our movement, and if we can sustain ourselves, the movement will sustain itself as well. This is my bibliography, citing some of the sources that I used for my presentation today. And I would like to thank those that supported me through my research and through this program in creating my oral history, Dr. Millward, Dr. Willoughby Harrar, Ms. LaShonda Carter, Dr. Cooks, Ms. Ella Turin, Dr. Carr, and of course, Dr. Bev Ditsie. And I'd like to thank my UCI ASW cohort and my Howard Mellon Mays cohort, as well as my wonderful family, my sisters and grandparents, and parents for getting me through this as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Greatly appreciate that. We've had two great presentations, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer just summary comments, probably lasting no more than 10 minutes total, and open up for a lively questions and answers from the panel. So we have quite a bit of time. We have roughly 30 minutes or so to work with because, as mentioned earlier, one of the panelists did not show up. And a lot of my comments, I maybe call them scratch comments because they may be all over the place. So forgive me about that. Just as a point of clarification, Cienna, you are at Howard University undergraduate school, right?
Yes, I am.
And Karen, are you a professor, graduate, or undergraduate?
Hold on. I'm a graduate student.
Graduate student. Okay. I know you're in art, so I don't know how they classify that.
Yeah.
And just one more point, Cienna, are you going to graduate school?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Okay, great. Just some general comments tying both papers together, then I'll go to each individual paper. And what I really raise in each individual paper more so is a set of questions, and I always do that in the event that both authors want to, if they haven't done so already, want to publish the work or take this work much further into perhaps a dissertation or thesis. And if as a footnote, if any of the panelists are headed to a doctoral program if they're not there, or to a thesis, writing a thesis, both works I think should be a part of that. Just in terms of both works, what I like about them is they're really telling stories that haven't been told. And it's an argument that I learned from an older activist who came out of the movement in the Memphis sanitation workers strike and other strikes. He said most of our stories have not been told, and if they've been told inaccurately. And so what I like about both works is that they're telling stories that are to some extent at the subaltern and subterranean level that need to be told in a much more deeper and complicated way. I also like both papers because they dive deeper into the multi-varied aspect of Black resistance, and resistance is more than just, for example, maybe engaging in civil disobedience and street protests, although albeit a shout out to that form of resistance. And it's also more than just, for example, being an advocate inside of the halls of a legislature, but it entails art and culture, and oftentimes artists are the artists broadly defined. That is, singers, people who write poetry, writers, um, people who produce visual art. They're actually oftentimes they're actually more free to explain, to talk about the so-called multifaceted Black predicament. And the idea that they can think that way, their freedom to think, is their greatest asset, which is also why in many authoritarian regimes, often the first groups to be decapitated are the artists and intelligentsia, because the idea that you're going to paralyze an artist from speaking her or his or their mind is something that artists almost never wants to give up. So, and then I also want to thank the panelists, because um, although oftentimes when we talk about resistance movements, and I think we're getting better at this in the last number of years, I think probably because of the work of the BLM, is we have to talk about resistance in nostalgic terms, so to speak. And I do fundamentally feel that we need to go back and tell and retell the stories of old, and I do that a lot in my work. But I also really like the fact that they're bringing the like contemporary voices, and contemporary people, contemporary moments of representation. Even Ms. Anderson, even your work, which focuses a lot on the historical piece, also comes up to the contemporary, which we have to do rather than just talking about these individuals when they pass away. Um, and then I also want to thank both panelists, because um, and I think I'll give a shout out to the UCI folks on this as well, for forcing political scientists, most of us and most of whom are probably overly enamored with numbers and quantitative research and empirical research and survey research. Nothing wrong with that, but forcing us to be diverse in our approaches, and diverse in how we look at research, and how we measure resistance. And I go back to, the idea of what these both papers do in terms of measuring so-called resistance and Black voices. And I go back to even, one of the, I haven't seen the new movie of the Panthers of Fred Hampton, but one of the key figures in the Panther Party was Emory Douglas, who was the Minister of Information, who was responsible for the artwork of the Panthers. And when I was Cienna, when I was your age, Emory Douglas would meet with activists and show all the artwork that he produced and all the photographs he produced. SNCC, for example, had a singing group. I go back to the 1930s with the Southern Negro Youth Congress, which also had a theater group, that did art. And just kind of emphasize this last point before moving on to each of those paper, probably one of the more famous acts of resistance in the last 60 years of California was the pilgrimage march from Delano to Sacramento with the farm workers. it really propelled, in many respects, the Robert F. Kennedy, the idea that Robert F. Kennedy could even attach himself to poverty and everything like that. At every single stop in every single farm worker town, at every single night, they would have a theater, a theatrical presentation. That so really kind of was a connection between, real deep down organizing work and also the idea that theater could be tied to that work. So I just want to kind of raise those up. I'll start with Ms. Anderson, and I'll just raise some questions more so, or comments rather than criticisms. And it'll be a little bit all over the place. I think you clearly demonstrate how Blackness has been vilified. I think you raised at the beginning of your paper um, a notation about how Black men see beauty, or how men see beauty. I'm sorry, and how the representations of how men see beauty, how that impacts our broader representation of Black women's beauty in particular. What I like about your research is that you talk about Black perceptions of Black women's beauty across the diaspora in the United States, but also on the continent. And for those of you who really want to take a look at her paper, she goes into the colonial or neo-colonial period of regimes that colonized different parts of Africa and how they used the authoritarian state and the state of colonization to create and try to recreate representations of beauty, and how Black women resisted through these kind of what James Scott would call infrapolitics, infrapolitical ways. The article clearly challenges, I'm going to see if I can say this right. Your article clearly challenges the idea that resistance must move beyond a materialist resistance. That is that, and this is a debate that has occurred oftentimes in the political science literature and may have involved, Marxists and other words, that is resistance total about addressing structures, capitalism, racism, classism, the structural racism, or can resistance can culture and representations be a weapon against resistance? So does one have to go out and organize to bring down, capitalism, so to speak? There's a debate about that. I think what your research is showing is that cultural resistance can be used as a weapon as much as material resistance as well, particularly in those neo-colonial and colonial regimes that you, I think, really outline, and really, I think you should expand upon that. Just some, not questions for you to answer, but maybe things that I'm a little bit surprised about. And I think it's really interesting. You point out that Dorothy Dandridge and Josephine Baker were actually marginalized. And I I know they were marginalized in terms of their entertainment, but you're saying that the depictions of them and who they should be, and I assume you even mean their skin color, that represented a marginalized portrait of who these women should be, and they wanted a deeper, more complicated viewpoint of their representation. And I was surprised about that, because I would have thought that maybe they would have been maybe more privileged than other Black women entertainers who maybe had darker skin and didn't necessarily have the eyes of Harry Belafonte. I just got done seeing Carmen Jones movie, so Dorothy Dandridge is fascinating to me in terms of who she is. But you make the opposite argument, that those two actually experienced a deeper level of marginalization because of the ways that the movies, the movie companies tried to define their own status and their own beauty. The latter part of the discussion about the photographers who captures, I think Serena Williams, or are those white? Just clear, are those white photographers or Black photographers?
White.
Yeah,
the photographer was white. The hair person was African, or he was British. He was African British.
African British. That's what I thought. Okay.
Yeah.
The one thing I want to see, I'm going to see if I can say this the right way because it's going to come across. I'm not really good with my words. Is that did black folks fall into, not black, did our resistance movements, broadly defined, did we fall into was our pushback against Aunt Jemima and that kind of representation? There should have been a pushback, but did that back us into a corner of maybe in
Well,
a subtle way?
there
Maybe
was
in a
no
subtle way.
pushback.
Yeah, let me see. Did that go ahead? Sorry, let me just. You can. Can't hear you. Yeah, unmute. I can't hear you. Let me
Can
see
you
if
hear
I
me
can
now?
ask this. I want to see if I can ask this question, and then I'm.
No, yeah, I see. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, let me ask this question, then you can respond
Okay.
in a round of comments. We should have quite a
Okay.
bit of time. I'm going to meet you. Did the representation, did our criticism of the Aunt Jemima depiction, as it should have been, and the Hattie McDaniel depiction, as it should have been, did that back us into a corner of not actually celebrating different depictions of Black beauty? I mean, so today it's Beyonce and it's that kind of representation of Black beauty, but the Black community is the beauty is diverse in terms of its beauty. And so I'm just wondering if did we overcorrect? I'm not saying we should have celebrated, but did we overcorrect? And so to the point to which we don't see a fuller representation of Black women's beauty in the contemporary landscape. I'll let you answer that question after the discussion, but I just want you to. I'm wondering about that, and I'm kind of the age category where many of the Black women I know have had health problems, health conditions, and that kind of their representations of beauty are almost never presented in the public landscape, even though they're beautiful. So I just kind of want you to consider that maybe later on. Let me move on to Cienna, and then we'll have them answer those questions, and we'll have another round of questions. This is a great piece. I think you do a great job at surveying the role that Bev Ditsie played in South Africa. I'm going to ask you again just a series of questions just to clarify. It's a great presentation because it offers a different mode of resistance. Just more interested in like where did Bev Ditsie come from? Where did she get her perspective of resistance? Was there a lineage of Black queer resistance in South Africa? Maybe there wasn't, but where did she come from? Who were her mentors? How did she develop this perspective? Especially given that it's clear that she was affected by or shaped by, I think she was shaped by a Black consciousness struggle. And I think if I'm correct about South Africa, I've been one time, but I could be incorrect, that there was a Black consciousness movement in the 1970s. And then there was also a vibrant anti-apartheid youth movement in the 1980s, particularly in the shanty towns. And I'm curious as to where did she get her development from, or maybe she just came to it on. Maybe she's like LeBron. Maybe she came to it on her own. So I'm curious about that. I'm curious in terms of time sequencing, and you mentioned that later on, it seemed like queer Black women were erased from the Pride scene, and I'm going to be naive in asking this question about the Pride scene in South Africa. I assume is that a multiracial Pride scene, and were Black queer women erased from that multiracial Pride scene? And I'm curious to see where she sees the colored, so to speak, of South Africa. It sounds like, based upon the literature that you show, that it is a regional Southern African movement that she's building. Namibia, Namibia, South Africa, and other kinds of efforts. So, my last point I'll say about this, and I'll ask the panelists to answer questions, and then we should have a good, there is something called social realism, which kind of comes out of a kind of a Marxist tradition, and so to speak. And she's producing seemingly a social realism using art to attack repression. But what she's doing may be something different and autonomous and unique to South Africa, and I hope it is, quite frankly, because it's not imported. It's something that's unique and autonomous. And I just wanted to see what you thought about that. So I'll let the panelists offer comments for 5 minutes each, and then we should have a good amount of discussion. I talked too much, so go ahead, Ms. Anderson, you first, and then Cienna.
One of the things I would like to, I don't know, okay, the best way to say this is information, before the internet, information was given and we didn't actually receive a whole bunch of things. And so the images of people like Josephine Baker and Dorothy Dandridge, those were curated. I mean, we only saw what the studios wanted us to see and when they wanted us to see. Josephine Baker spent a lot of time trying to have a career here. As a matter of fact, she left the US, went to France, was successful, came back here, tried to do Broadway. Newspapers trashed her, told her she was ugly, said she looked like some kind of animal, a buck tooth, something or other. And she said, fine, I'm done. And so it totally limited what she could do here because she didn't fit the stereotype of what they wanted us to look like. And I laugh because I think about all of the times I was thinking Josephine Baker. I was like college age, before I actually saw images of her, because it was done, that was not something that was always released. It wasn't put in the newspapers. It might have been in a Black newspaper, but those newspapers didn't last very long. The newspapers from the 1930s weren't the ones in the 70s or the 80s. And so those images were gone. Oh, wait. What happened? Are you guys still there?
There, you're still there.
Yes.
I just
Okay.
put you on spotlight. Yeah, I think it's.
Oh,
I think,
you put me on spotlight. Okay.
Cienna might have. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, and so those were gone. It was one of the things I learned when I first got to Chicago, and I saw all of the African-American artists that exist that nobody had ever told me about. It was like, oh my God, all of my history. I thought I was an AP student, and I got here and realized half of the history I knew I didn't know. It was the same thing with them. They had a person they wanted a type up front, and that was the Hattie McDaniels. And those were the people we saw. We saw them in movies, and those were the Black people we saw. We didn't see the elegant, beautiful, thin, the people who look like them, who look like their top models or their top actresses. We didn't have folks who look like them. And Hattie McDaniel, she won an Academy Award, 1939. She spent the rest of her life playing maids. But she said, you know what? I'd rather play one than be one. Mm-hmm. And what else did you ask me? I tried to take notes.
Well, I think you answered the question well enough. I think let's get Cienna to respond, and then we'll get questions and answers for 10 minutes. Cienna, did you want to respond to the comments?
Mm-hmm. Those are really good questions. I think it's funny that you mentioned, the possibility of her just coming upon these things, because it kind of did happen that way. She talked a lot about the politics in her house. She lived with her mother and her aunt, and they're very autonomous women. And it wasn't until men from the outside would enter her home and expect women to behave in a certain way that she felt that women had to act a certain way within society, and just naturally kind of resisted that. She kind of resented the idea that, women should go to the kitchen and do certain things when men aren't present in the house. They're fully autonomous and they have a full range of tasks and abilities. So just that kind of, I guess, influence from her mom and her aunt, and just a lot of the women in her family being present in the house and being fully capable, enabled her to be that way outside of the home too. So when it came to growing up in school and, kind of discovering that, she was a young queer Black woman, and that she was different and being treated differently, she resented the idea of, tucking away. So when it came to her activism and even her mentor, Simon and Coley, she was mentioning how being out and being proud of her queerness, whether, they had words or language to define it yet, her being proud of learning who she was and, being very public about it, marching the streets. She would talk about being so colorful with her friends and marching the streets with their friends and people pointing and being confused about who they were and what the point of it all was. And they were just confident to be themselves. That became the movement itself. So she was involved with this kind of visual representation and didn't even, mean to come into activism per se. Like she always says, like she doesn't lesbian for a living, but her identity was something that became that political force for change, so she could speak at the UN conference and she could help lead the first Pride Parade in Johannesburg and found other organizations and be a part of this movement. It was really just about being confident in her identity and helping to kind of diffuse that from that point on. But I don't think she ever really intended to be an activist. It just ended up being so. That's a really good question. It ended up happening that way. I think I'm trying to recall the last part of the question.
I think you did well right now. I think I don't want to hog up the other questionnaires, so we can open up to people who have questions or comments. And
Okay.
this is a small group. You can come into. You can open up your video if you want, or just raise your hand and ask questions. Any questions for the audience?
Hi, it's LaShonda. Excellent. Both of you did excellent work. I wanted to ask or pose for Karen, some other actresses who are running concurrently with Hattie McDaniel, and I would say they're all cultivated identities of Blackness. Like these are all cultivated kinds of formations of Black womanhood. Um, um, Ethel Waters, you point to Dandridge, you point to Josephine Baker. Around the same time that Hattie McDaniel won the Oscar, which is why everybody pays so much attention to her particular image. She's not the only actress that was out there though at the time. There's Lena Horne, that's a different kind of cultivated image of Blackness. And so I guess I'm wondering how you're, because what I'm not having read your paper and just listening to your presentation, it sounds like you're arguing that that the Hattie McDaniel Mammy figure is the only figure that was being used to represent Blackness. And I want to push back on that a little bit because I think it's much more complicated than they were just showing us the Mammy. Actually, they were showing us all of these other mulatto images, or Josephine Baker was an exoticized Black woman with the bananas, even in Europe, like with the bananas and the jungle routine. It wasn't none of these images were particularly celebratory of Black women as we live in society. So I'm wondering if your larger project actually complicates a little bit of the argument that you made here today, because the myriad of positions we can't occupy that they showed us in the media through music and movies. And the fact that Hattie McDaniel is the one who is acclaimed because she won the Oscar and is the first person that comes to mind for Black people when we talk about Black actresses, also speaks to something, I think, deeper than just like a kind of surface beauty aesthetic, she represented not just, and Hattie McDaniel is beautiful, and I want to make clear that I'm not suggesting that that folks who occupy body types that look like Hattie McDaniel is not. Hattie McDaniel is beautiful, and I do take what Sekou is saying too, like in our push for certain things, are we closing off particular ideologies of beauty? So I just want to, for your larger project, how do you position these other actresses who are also garnering a particular kind of respectability in their craft, but are not considered, like they're like something outside of Blackness?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand
Okay.
exactly what you're asking, but, and let me make sure I'm clear, but you're talking about how we see these folks, correct?
Well, I'm talking about how they're mobilized on screen and how they're mobilized.
Well, yeah, and that's where I was coming from, because the ones you see, the ones that they put out there, the ones, it's kind of like the magazines, you know, it's the ones that that will show up. We might get 1 or 2 a year, and then one year we got a whole bunch. It's like the one they put out there was Hattie, because I think Hattie was safe to them. She made them feel good about themselves.
Too, that's out there at the same time. Ethel Waters is quite popular at the same time.
She is, but she's not making those major motion pictures. The studio is not pushing her. She is struggling.
Okay.
Yeah, you know, it's like later, like in the late 40s, she gets a TV show and some stuff like that. But at that particular time, at the time that Aunt Jemima became became really popular, and all of these things were going on, the mammy was the thing they had out there for us. They weren't, but remember, this is like 1910, 1920, when the Klan is starting up. They are not trying to put any type of good type of image for African Americans out there. It ain't nothing that's going to be positive or cute or good. This is right around that time. So that's why it was like, you know what, we'll let her have this, but we won't give them anything else.
Okay.
To LaShonda's point, Karen, and LaShonda, maybe I didn't do a good job summarizing it, but to your point about the Josephine Baker and Dorothy Dadge, she actually does address that in actually this paper.
Oh yeah, I saw that. I saw in the slides that she and that's what I said, that she points to Dorothy Dandridge, and she does point to Josephine Baker. But there's a myriad of actresses who are being mobilized in the media at the same time. So I was just wondering how they show up in her work. That's all.
Great comments. Okay, do we have any other questions or comments? And we're technically required to stop at 5:30. I'm sorry, 6:30. I'm on Central Time. We can go to 6:35 because we started 5 minutes late because of the technical issues. So we have about 10 minutes. Are there any comments or questions more?
Cienna,
go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on the original question that you asked, like, have we kind of pushed into something that is limiting still of our view of Blackness and Black beauty? I think it's an interesting question because it seems to have less to do with kind of the spectatorship that, you know, that makes us ask this question, and more of the authorship. And I think it's something that Bev Ditsie is really about, this autonomy of being able to write and document your own narrative, because a lot of these commercialized, the commercialized images of beauty and Black beauty that we're reviewing, really, like historically, don't really have a lot of Black authorship. So I feel like, that being said, you know, with the exception of Tyler Mitchell, for instance, being the first African-American photographer to cover an American Vogue shoot, these Black bodies aren't being captured and perceived by Black artists, even in, you know, in this kind of light. So
they are not.
They are not on the faces of these magazines, and, you know, in the face of popular media. Even when it comes to Hollywood, like, a lot of the directors and everything are still predominantly white. So I think when it comes to, have we limited ourselves in this view of Blackness, the we isn't even really we, because we're not authoring the things that are being produced. So we can say that, you know, it can be this, you know, it could be the mammy archetype, or it could be some slim, you know, like a colonized version of Black beauty as well. But if we're not articulating these versions of beauty ourselves, and it's not really a conversation about what we think about it, because we are able to view both as beautiful, and we are able to see everything in between, you know? So I think it's just an interesting question, and it really just pushes this notion of autonomy needing to be at the center too, because then we can really see we don't evaluate Black beauty in the same sense that these are being portrayed in on the covers of magazines and everything. I think that we're all accepting within our own community. We are not given the agency to have the full range of Blackness be the present image. So I think it's interesting.
Part of my question was driven by also, I mean, the older you get, the more you realize that your image is not static. You get sick and you recover from being sick, and
yeah,
and your body changes, and it's and when you go to pick up your kids from school, you know, their mothers and their grandparents, people they're not like one image of Black beauty, so to speak. There's multiple images of Black beauty, but I guess I was kind of, it's more than just Beyonce and this arena. It's and then, you know, if you go back and look at, you know, Sojourner Truth and look at her, you know, Harriet Tubman, I mean, they're seen as fierce and
definitely.
take no mess. They're never identified as beautiful by contemporary pro-Black, you know, folks. So I guess that's kind of where a lot of my comments were coming from in terms of, are we recreating, even in our celebration of the alternative to Hattie McDaniels, and our celebration of that, are we reproducing the same kind of misrepresentations of Black beauty that we're trying to fight against by not diversifying that representation that actually exists?
And I think in doing so, it really just shows us that from an Africana perspective, that we need to be critical of the Western lens, right? So it's like, we do this as a society, as a part of this Western society, you know? So we end up regurgitating and recreating, like everything becomes, what is the word I'm looking for? Like, not necessarily reactive, but like a subversion of the beauty that is handed to us. But within the politics of representation in general, like as a part of Black aesthetic discourse, representation itself cannot be all encompassing by the very nature of the term, you know? So when we have to analyze, when we have to look to modes of representation for comprehensive definitions of beauty that, you know, we're really just subverting, that we get from a Western paradigm, we're not going to get a solution. So it is true that, you know, these women aren't included in the discourse, but it's like, it wasn't originally authored by us, and the ones that have been so pushed by media and have been pushed by popular culture are subversions of the things that were handed to us, which are still not all encompassing. So I agree. I don't think that these women are also included, though they are beautiful, and though we are able to see that from I guess a cultural perspective, we're able to value their beauty, and we're able to even understand the forces that would render them not beautiful from some people's perspective, right? But we don't have to subvert them in order to appreciate them. So yeah, I agree.
Okay. I said we will go 5 minutes over, so we have 5 minutes. I know we have some other folks that are with us. Are there any other questions or comments? Does someone want to shout out a question or put a question in the chat room? I think Alex Goodwin is with us. Okay, well, what I'll do is I'll offer any closing remarks by the panelists. Great stuff. I'm hoping that you could take this research some places. So are there any closing comments from the panelists?
I will say that I had never considered any of the work that I did to be political science until I did this project. So it's nice for, even though my research is intended to challenge this notion of, you know, visual art and visual studies within the arena of activism and political activism specifically. I'm also being challenged to see that as well. And ever since this project, I've actually been more involved with filmmakers and film curation. I'm able to see how that works as a social force even more now than ever. So yeah, my own project has challenged a lot of what I believe to be true politically, but what I'm now practicing, seeing, and experiencing. So I've really enjoyed doing this project, and I hope to take it further, and I hope to stay in contact with Ditsie and have her interact with my career as a graduate student.
Okay. Have you figured out where you're going to graduate school yet, or is it still undetermined? You can't say?
I know, I say it might be a secret, but I'm looking at UCI, so I think I'll end up there.
Okay.
That's no secret.
It's not a secret.
Okay. Ms. Anderson, do you have the last comments?
I enjoyed the political part of this too, just thinking about this in this particular way, because I'm telling you, when I started, I was thinking totally different. I was thinking more of the images and how they were used, and more along everything you said, Cienna. I was like, yes, because we didn't take part in the role of deciding or choosing, and now we can. And as we look back, it's like, okay, how do I feel about this? Because the one thing about us and Black is beautiful. Everything is beautiful. It ain't we ain't got no rules about nothing. When I got to Chicago and I saw girls walking around in midriffs and their stomach hanging out, I was like, well, you know what? All right, everybody, come on. Everything is beautiful all the time. And so I appreciate the feedback and everything you guys have given me. And I think it helps this project. And I totally appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. And LaShonda, thank you for all the work that you're doing with the UCI project as well. And Alex, thank you for joining us. And this is being recorded. They're going to offer an unedited version of this. The general sessions they clean up this one, and so they won't clean up. So we're going to try to download as many to a YouTube page. I have to talk to Dr. Willoughby or Rod about that. But even still, once the it's going to take a few weeks for them to clean up all the video, to get all the videos together. So this is being recorded, and really appreciate all that you are doing. Thank you.
Have a good night.
Bye-bye.